The next panel. So if people in the hallways can hear me, we're going to try and start.
Entirely a synthetic.
Okay, yeah. And then after this part here, actually, don't take them too far because we're going to be like 10 seconds. Just move the two on and
Circulating blood.
this one back. Yeah, and then
There's a microbiome.
and then just move still a little bit like this. Can we throw that out? And then we just move that one back for now. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, when they take
So I'm going to ask the next panel to come up, and we're going to try and get some people come in from the little break. Monique, you want to sit at the end here for as a moderator? This is.
I'm Daphne Miller.
You know, I've seen you walking. I was going to tell you, I loved your stuff. So I'm Monique Sherman. Yeah.
Great. Oh, this is cozy.
Yeah,
The other panels.
Well, that's what I said. That's what I'm hoping.
Thank you. It'd be really nice.
Yeah, no, I'm very happy.
Yeah, I'm going to very much limit my intro so we can talk.
I usually have to get up and walk when I show my slides. You're fine. Okay. Especially since I don't have a laser pointer, so I actually have to get up and.
I was hoping someone would do some movement. I sat in the back of the room the whole time. And,
I do. I
Good afternoon, everybody. I think we're going to get started again. This session is a considerably smaller panel. It's the four of us. I'm Monique Schoenhager. I'm a physician, a perinatologist, or a high-risk pregnancy doctor. I live in Tucson, Arizona, and I've been there since about 2003. I am a practitioner of medicine. I'm a physician. I do not do research. I see patients every day. I'm on call I deliver babies, I do surgery, I do all kinds of procedures for the high-risk patient and baby. The other people here with me do research and are also physicians. I think that this particular session will be a little different than the one we had earlier today, because I'm hoping to get some practical information from everyone and a little bit about what our individual experiences have been as physicians in this area. I'm here obviously because there's a lot of discussion on the microbiome and how it affects children and delivery, and I'd be happy to give some of my perspective as well. Laura, could you talk a little bit for us, please?
Sure. Should I go ahead and, can you put up my slides? So I'm Laura Kahn. I'm a physician and a research scholar at Princeton University. I do not see patients. I do policy research, and so that means I study what governments do or do not do in regards to health or bio issues. And I want to thank Sandy Lewis for having the inspiration to bring this, convene this conference together. I want to talk a little bit about One Health, which I mentioned earlier today. One Health is the concept that human, animal, and environmental health are linked. And that might seem obvious, but that's generally not what we do. And this concept is this term One Health is relatively new, but the concept is really quite ancient. This is something that was intuitively known by the indigenous peoples for thousands of years. And even Hippocrates, the ancient Greek physician, recognized that when people went to low-lying swampy areas, they would get sick. And indeed, the term malaria literally means bad air. So this is not a new concept, but we're trying to reinvent it now for the challenges of what we're living in. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about giving you a One Health perspective on antimicrobial resistance in agriculture, because I use this concept that human, animal, and environmental health are linked as a framework for examining complex issues like antimicrobial resistance, like food security. So I'm going to talk about both the importance of food security and then antimicrobial resistance. Next slide, please. Now, agriculture is the foundation of civilization, and all of you who work in producing our food are the vanguards of civilization. You're our heroes, because without you, we would be, we would have to be all trying to grow our food rather than get to practice medicine or whatever else, because we would be just so busy trying to grow our own food. Now, unfortunately, agriculture is threatened by climate change. And next slide, please. Now, this is a timeline of the temperature of the planet since the beginning of complex life on the planet. And if you look over to your far left, you can see the Paleozoic era. Now, the planet was very hot back then, and we had palm trees in Antarctica, but humanity didn't exist back then, nor did agriculture. If you move further to the right, you can see at the Pliocene, the planet started to cool. And then you get to the Pleistocene, and that is the Ice Age. Now, humanity did exist, but there was not agriculture. And you didn't have agriculture for the simple reason is that the planet was too cold, and a lot of it was covered with glaciers. Now, as you start getting right, you get to the Holocene, and you see that the temperature of the planet starts to warm. And right when it gets to that baseline there, that's when agriculture began, about 10,000 years ago, and that's when civilization began too. And indeed, for the entire duration of civilization, during the Holocene era in which we live, the temperature of the planet has been remarkably stable and consistent, allowing farmers to know when to plant and when to harvest and when to have relatively mild weather to water the crops. So in other words, everything that we take for granted here is because the climate has allowed agriculture, which is the foundation of civilization. Now, there have been a little bit of deviations. For example, the Little Ice Age, you see a little blip there. The temperature of the planet cooled by about 2 degrees or so. And if you go to the next slide, please. Next slide, please. There we go. The painters at that time during the Little Ice Age documented what it looked like for us. It was a frozen wasteland. The Thames would freeze over, and they would have frost fairs. You had ice skating in Rotterdam, and you had frozen wastelands in the Flemish region. The Little Ice Age was noted for crop failures, bread riots, famines, and wars. And this was global. And if you're interested in this, it was outlined by Jeffrey Parker in Global Crisis and Nature's Mutiny by Philip Blom. And Philip Blom identified that witch burnings usually would happen after a particularly bad season of crop failure and famine because somebody had to be blamed, and it was usually poor elderly women. So civilization was severely affected by the Little Ice Age. Now go back one slide, please. Now the World Bank estimates that now, instead of being too cold by 2 degrees, we are now going above this Holocene baseline. We are now about 1.5 degrees above, and we're hoping to stay as close to this Holocene baseline as possible. So when we're talking about climate change, we're talking about change from this Holocene baseline that has allowed agriculture and civilization to exist, everything that we take for granted. And so if we continue with business as usual, much of the world is going to become too hot and too dry to grow food, and our food security then will collapse, and we'll have a lot of hungry people and huge humanitarian crises, the which we are just beginning to see now. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay, so now just as agriculture is the foundation of civilization, antibiotics are the foundation of modern medicine, and antimicrobial resistance threatens modern medicine. Next slide, please. So the question then we must ask is, can we have our pork chops and antibiotics too? Because we both need food security, and antibiotics for a modern advanced society. Next slide, please. So as we've been hearing in through this day, we do not really know what goes on in the soil in our planet. We need to understand our microbial world better because that's what we live in a microbial world. And we need to work with nature, not against it. Right now, we are working against it. Next slide, please. As you have heard earlier today, humans and animals have their microbiomes, and these microbiomes are as important to our health and well-being as any organ. Next slide, please. But our indiscriminate antibiotic use in both medicine and agriculture is jeopardizing our use of antibiotics. And the question then we must ask is large-scale animal agriculture ecologically sustainable? And I spoke recently or earlier today about all the manure that's being produced, changing the biome of the planet. That's really just not sustainable. The waste is not only from the manure, from microbial, but those microbes in the manure are also producing methane and nitrous oxide, which are extremely potent greenhouse gases. So we are not only affecting, so agriculture is both threatened by climate change and contributes to it through greenhouse gases. Next slide, please. So this is a very important TED Talk that I encourage all of you to watch. It's by Dr. Stephanie Strathdee, saved her husband's life, Tom Patterson. He had a pan-resistant Acinetobacter baumannii infection. He was dying. He was in the ICU with multi-organ failure. She came upon phage therapy, contacted some phage researchers. They infused it into his body, and 3 days later, he woke up and he was cured. Oh, bacteriophage. You see that little thing that looks like an alien spaceship? That is a bacteriophage. That is a tiny virus that is the natural foe against bacteria. So that is one strategy to deal with antimicrobial resistance, is using phages, and there's a whole long history, and I'm sorry, I don't have the time to go into it now, but because of the success of that, UC San Diego has now established a phage therapy and research center, the first one in North America. So That's a strategy where we can actually work with nature using the natural foe against bacteria to treat our infections. Next slide, please. So in other words, we need to maintain our civilization on a hotter and drier planet, and the way we must do it is to use a multifaceted One Health approach, looking at humans, animals, and the environment, integrating it in how we approach our health and well-being. So with that, I think that's my last slide. Just go to one, is that it? Yes, so thank you very much, and sorry I took up so much time. Oh, sorry.
I got my own. That was fantastic. My name is Louis Cohen. I'm also a physician. I'm a gastroenterologist. I work in New York City at Mount Sinai. And I do that with about 20% of my time, where I only take care of patients who have inflammatory bowel disease, which is a disease many people have sort of heralded as evidence of issues with the human microbiome. And the other 80% of my time, I run a lab. It's a lab dedicated to the study of the microbiome. And maybe as a researcher who does this, I should be the person up here telling you about how everything you see and read is absolutely true, and this is amazing. And in fact, actually, I have to spend most of my time trying to explain to people what an audience member and one of our panelists had said earlier, that this field is in its infancy. And to say it's in its infancy probably isn't even the correct thing. I mean, it's in its absolute earliest possible phase. And to put it in perspective, we sequenced the human genome. That was a big deal, right? And where did people go with that? Well, they said, that was great and really cool, but what the heck do these genes do? And now we're stuck there, right? That genetics are basically ones and zeros. And so with the human microbiome, you now have a collection of tons of genomes. And guess what? They transfer genes between each other. And guess what? We have no clue what any of those genes do. So when you read these awesome things in the New York Times, or you hear people stand up in front of you and tell you about probiotics, or about how the microbiome causes this disease, or if anyone ever uses the word proof, or we've proven, they're lying to you. We have no idea. There's a couple facts we do know. The microbiome is important, right? And this is just when you sort of step back from a very complex system, and that's why I love that earlier, and you ask a very simple question. And it's this idea that I always talk to my patients about. There's no such thing as a good bacteria. That is just nonsense, right? And I always say to them, if I took a poop here on the floor and I pulled it up in a syringe and I injected it into your arm, you would never, ever come back and see me ever again. You'd be like, that is the worst doctor I've ever seen. And that's because people have it wrong. This is about evolution, right? Bacteria were there before we were. And this was actually a phenomenal conversation I never thought about earlier when we were talking, and said, you can almost say that we are basically a vesicle for these bacteria, that they're maybe smarter than we are in some senses. And so, yes, our immune system, our metabolic systems, who we are, it's intimately tied to them. And I think about it the same way you have to think about sun, right? Your skin evolved to protect you from the sun. And if you get too much sun, you'll get burned. But you're also going to use the sun to make vitamin D. And it's the same relationship with this bacteria. We have to, and now that we understand also more, the phages and the fungi and the complex ecosystem that is our body. And so we have to protect ourselves from them. But at the same time, they are just a part of who we are. They are just like the air we breathe. Now, what you see in the literature, a lot of it is basically correlative analyses. And it's also just common sense that as you vary the environment, these bacteria will change. Well, what does that actually mean? How does that translate to human health? And that is what we have no clue about, okay? And that's important to understand that, yes, the bacteria will change in patients with diseases. Guess what? The bacteria caused diabetes. No, it didn't. It was that people with diabetes take a medication called metformin, and that medication actually changes the bacteria. Now, there's still a signature there where the bacteria are important to metabolism, but we're now trying to just figure out what that is and how to look at an insanely complex system and start to piece out the little bits and pieces that are important. And so what I do is I say, what would be those important pieces? And that's going to actually be the molecules and the metabolites these bacteria make, because this is what they did in the environment. We would call those same metabolites that bacteria in the soil make antibiotics, right? That's how bacteria communicate with the world. And so the bacteria inside of us are doing the same thing. And so in my lab, we dissect out just one metabolite at a time and ask a question, what can that do? And then we try to build on that and understand the complexity and go through that system, with the goal being to start to actually be able to make statements where we would say, yes, when you shift the bacteria because you're changing your diet, when you shift the bacteria because of a disease state, this might be the expected physiologic outcome of that. And unfortunately, because of the excitement of the microbiome, a lot of people have taken advantage of that, and that has unfortunately translated down to a lot of patients. So I have people that will walk into my office and hand me this really cool sheet of paper. You know how much that sheet of paper cost them? It was about $2,000 to get their microbiome sequenced. And I said, oh, wow, this is amazing. You have healthy bacteria, because I study this and I have no idea what a healthy bacteria is. And basically the NIH spent about $500 million to just ask one question. Is there such a thing as a common microbiome? And you know what the answer was? No. So we're still trying to understand this. And I'm not saying that it isn't real. It's incredibly important. But it requires a meeting like this, where you start to bring together people, because guess what? What I do in my lab, I'm stealing from the soil microbiome people. And what they do, they can learn from us. So this is an incredible opportunity. I'm excited to be here, to hopefully just learn. And, you know, I got to say that the conversation that happened before, and they always said the big animal doctors, the veterinarians, well, I'm a big animal doctor too. And, you know, I appreciate you having me.
That's great. I'm Daphne Miller. Good afternoon. I'm sorry I arrived a little late. I was still midair when you started the conference this morning. I think I was supposed to be on that panel. I'm a family physician and also a professor, a clinical professor at University of California, San Francisco. And I'm also a project scientist at University of California, Berkeley. And I have a split personality. Part of my week, I am a clinician seeing patients and teaching residents and medical students in the university hospital. And part of my week, I'm actually working at the nexus of agriculture and food production and health, and trying to envision how do we build a healthier food system for all of us. And honestly, I, within my career, have not yet figured out how to bridge these two worlds. And it is something that I feel we all desperately need to do if we are going to actually make these big aspirational changes that we've been talking about. It's an unbelievably challenging thing to start to create new paradigms of thought, new science, new languages for talking about this transdisciplinary work. And the evidence being, even with this amazing conference you put together, the health people, we're all here in our little silo, and we just had the food people, or the, you know, the farmers and the veterinarians in the last one, because we haven't figured out how to talk to each other. It's wonderful. We're actually all in the same sandbox here, which is great, but we have our toys and you have your toys, and we use different lingo and jargon, and we do different kinds of research. And I just finished teaching a course to the medical students that was an agroecology and health course. And the biggest complaint I got from the class was that I was asking them to read journal articles that were from agricultural journals, and how could they possibly vet that kind of research? Yeah. They were in medical school, for goodness sakes. And so what we have to do is start moving beyond the whole way that we think about what we do. So farmers and people in ag sciences, your job is not to make food. Your job is to make health and to build healthy communities and healthy environments. And doctors, our job is not to cure disease. Our job is to make health and build healthy communities and healthy environments. Until we start to actually get together and figure out how we're going to do this together. And we can call this whatever you want. We can call it One Health. We can call it hula dancing for all I'm caring. But we need to figure out how to start to work together. And hopefully, over the course of the next day and a half, we're going to have our little conversation here, but then we're going to have to break out from our little quorum and really try to figure out how to collaborate with each other. And that means not just being focused on one chemical or one substance that's your favorite evil chemical, because, industry gets that, and they're just going to go and come up with another chemical. It means not being just focused on one new flashy toy, which is the microbiome. Because in fact, that's only one thing that is linking us to agriculture. There's many, and to our environment in general. And so really this is about a paradigm shift. It's about changing our minds, changing our relationships, changing the way we do science together and the way we work together in communities.
Thank all of you. Thank you for everyone for talking a little bit about what they do. I would like the four of us really to have a conversation about what we do on a daily basis. And I know I sat in the back of the room today, and I got the impression that people were really talking at a high level. Everyone was speaking theoretically about various things and how we can bring them together and how eventually we can get to a place of peace and harmony, except for the talk regarding vaccinations. That was very specific.
We'll let that
slide. So I was hoping that perhaps the four of us could be a little bit more specific about what we do on a daily basis and how that may intersect with the microbiome to give people an idea of where we are in the medicine. I don't know who'd like to go first.
No, they've heard enough from me for a while, please. Or you guys have your hand.
Louis, you want to?
Sure. So, I'd say that there's two ways that the microbiome integrates from a practical standpoint in terms of what I do. First is in the patients I take care of. A lot of people always have questions about the uncertainty of the disease they have, right? That it's that inflammatory bowel disease is a disease that comes and goes with seemingly a mind of its own. And, I think that what happens a lot of the time in...
Louis, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but could you just describe for people a little bit what symptoms of IBS are like?
So irritable bowel syndrome is, what happens to people when they eat too many tacos, and they get bloating and uncomfortable, and it can range in things in terms of how the bowel moves and senses. Inflammatory bowel disease is a disorder of the immune system of the bowel, and so the immune system of the gastrointestinal tract has been challenged with a really interesting problem, which is that it has trillions of bacteria and fungi and viruses that are part of who you are. And so that immune system, and somebody said, it's separated by one cell, which is, one way of thinking about it. But your immune system of the intestinal tract is in constant contact with these organisms, the microbiome. If it tried to fight them, it would be like you just being pissed off at the ocean and kicking it to try to make it go away. It's not going to go away. The waves will keep crashing. So your immune system in the intestine has learned a trick called tolerance, which isn't stupidity. It just means it's going to be tolerant. So long as they're on their side of the fence and I'm on my side, we'll hang out. When you try to get out of line, we're going to turn on. We call that inflammation. And then I'm going to get rid of you and then turn off. This balance gets disrupted in a portion of patients, and then that can lead to dysregulation of the immune system, which basically leads the immune system to start attacking these bacteria when it shouldn't, which then leads patients to have symptoms such as diarrhea, bleeding of the intestine, losing weight, pain. It's basically like having a horrific infectious colitis 24/7 because basically you're being infected by all these bacteria that live inside of you. And so as a result of this complex interaction between bacteria and the host, a lot of these patients are trying to look for answers. And we're trying to look for answers. And I think one of the biggest things that I say every single day is, I don't know. It doesn't mean I don't know what we can do, but I don't know. I don't understand this system. I'm trying so hard to figure it out. But what I do know is that the bacteria that live in yogurt live in yogurt. They don't live in people. that when you take these things that are called probiotics, that was not discovered because of any probiotic property, right? That this is a loophole of the FDA. It's a loophole of how things went through. And a lot of this is just what's being done. Now, people are working to understand it, but that doesn't mean it's going to fix your IBD. The second thing is that people will sort of ask a lot about what we call prebiotics. You know, if I change my diet a certain way, if I do these things, what does that mean? And I explain to them, yes, there's an answer here. I just don't know what it is yet. Just trying to figure out what's in broccoli would take my lab, you know, a natural products lab, probably 14 years to dissect every single molecule in broccoli and how that interacts with us. It doesn't mean there's not something there, but I don't know yet. But what I do think is that each person is an individual. I think what we've learned is that your immune system early in life, what its job is to learn how to adapt. And so it's learned to adapt to the things that you're exposed to your environment, to the foods you eat, to the stuff that comes through, to the pollutants, to the good things, the bad things. And ultimately that becomes who you are. And what's cool is, well, not cool, but what's part of inflammatory bowel disease is a disorder of that regulation. And so a lot of what I do on a day-to-day is actually explaining to patients how complex this system is, explaining that I don't know, but there are things that we do know, and then helping to walk them through what are good ways of them listening to their own body, their own signals that are coming from them because they're unique, and then to understand what we would expect in terms of the medications we have. On the flip side, I try to then weaponize the microbiome. So in my lab, as we discover how individual microbes or groups of microbes make things that affect human biology, you can imagine developing that into a drug. So we like to think about that from a therapeutic standpoint, where we can then take collections of microbes, and I'm going to say something that may not be popular, or engineer bacteria to make things in a way that you could actually help human health. Now, what they're making are natural products, so I can tell you that that's organic. But at the same time, you know, people have to remember that whether or not you decide to purify, somebody mentioned a bark from a tree that inhibits the growth of something. Well, guess what? That is a natural product. It's probably an antibiotic. And if I spent my time in my lab purifying that, now it's a drug. But if you take the tree, it's not. But yet this impact you can have on the microbiome is identical, because most of the drugs we have are natural products. So part of what I do also is trying to understand those things and develop them therapeutically.
So do you tell your patients to take probiotics or prebiotics for their irritable bowel syndrome?
No, I tell them to use that money and go to dinner with their family, or maybe take a trip somewhere and enjoy life.
I have to tell a funny story. So part of what I do, a little piece of my week, is I get to write 2 health columns a month for the Washington Post. And I did one recently where I was interviewing Rob Knight. Has anybody, a lot of people in the room know Rob Knight. He's another preeminent microbiologist who's doing a lot of research on the microbiome. And I asked him that very same question. And he started into this story about how he lives in Southern California. He just bought 2 lime trees and planted them in his garden, and went to the local nursery and bought some, fertilizer for his lime trees, and it said on it, "new with probiotics." And he put this on his 2 lime trees, and within a couple weeks, they were both dead. And he said, that's evidence that probiotics don't work. And that is an N of 2 study, and it's much better than most of the studies that are out there.
So I do want to be clear, though. Probiotics are a real concept, right? It's just we're not there yet, right? It's this idea that this field is in its infancy. There's a lot of excitement, a lot of money, a lot of people are working hard. And probably at the end of the day, probiotics, you're going to have some, like the ones that a lot of the venture capital is investing in now, where a group of bacteria have a set of functions that you can actually treat the same way you treat a drug. You take a pill every day, and that function will be something that you deal with. But I think the dream that people have is that you'll understand someone's individual biology, and then you can mix and match sort of what would be true probiotics to fit that person's physiology. And that is, not a pipe dream, but it's a little bit further down the line.
How about a metabolite like butyrate?
So butyrate's a great example. Everybody studies butyrate because there's oh, sure. So butyrate's a short-chain fatty acid. Basically, your colon is, I always talk about it's a challenge, right? You got all these bacteria, they're eating stuff. And what was funny, so I come from a soil microbiome lab, and soil bacteria are way more complex because they have to fight every single day. Their genomes are huge. The molecules they make are really crazy. Human microbes have a good deal. they just get food 24/7, and they just sit there eating, and they're happy. But as a result, they actually take a lot of that food away from the lining of the colon. So the colonocytes have actually learned how to use some of these byproducts, such as short-chain fatty acids, as a carbon source, as a fuel. So bacteria in the gut make a lot of these. These are fermentation products when you eat complex carbohydrates. And they're generally considered healthy for the gut. But then I could also quote you an article where they show that it inhibits with DNA changes. So we don't really know. But a lot of us study short-chain fatty acids because A, no one knew how to actually find metabolites from the gut. But if you talk to soil microbiologists, they could have told you to find metabolites forever because that's what they did. And the other thing is it's very abundant. So people have looked at the idea of, well, can you isolate the metabolites that the bacteria in your gut make and use them therapeutically? So butyrate is an example where patients who have a certain type of colitis, which is called diversion colitis, which basically what happens is if you get a bowel surgery where no longer the nutrients go through the bowel, but you still have bowel there, the colon wall starts to die because it doesn't get this nutrient. So you can actually do enemas of these short-chain fatty acids and actually restore the balance of your bowel. So the idea of using metabolites from the microbiome therapeutically is absolutely another avenue. Butyrate is one of them, and it's been studied just because it was easy for us to do. But now there's a lot of interest in trying to understand, well, what is the total breadth of these metabolites? By the way, if you ever have smelled a short-chain fatty acid, it is horrific. So one time when I started in the lab, I actually ordered some, and I opened up the bottle, and I didn't do it in the hood. And let's just say I was the least favorite person in my lab. And so for those of you who are thinking, oh, I can go to a compounding pharmacy and get it, it's pretty raw. It's pretty gross.
Wine medicine is getting excited.
Yeah.
Yeah,
no, and it was cool what you said about the agricultural literature. So I found myself in that way. We were doing a project where we were trying to actually identify whether or not some of the bacteria inside of us make an antibiotic. And there was this one bacteria we kept finding that was really annoying because it kept killing everything. And so we weren't really studying the bacteria, we were studying the DNA. And it turns out actually that it had a plasmid, which is part of how bacteria will transfer genetic information, especially antibiotic resistance genes. And it actually had a plasmid that made a toxin. And when we traced back, because we had the DNA, it actually came from poultry farming. So this was something that we saw in E. coli that infect poultry and causes problems. And we actually were finding that DNA in our own bodies. And so then I had to suddenly go and was reading poultry literature, and I'm quoting this. And then, of course, the snobs in the biological sciences are like, poultry, this is crap. And I'm like, no, it's great. But yeah, no, this I think sort of gets at this idea of this connection between everybody.
So clinically, I am an obstetrician gynecologist that does high-risk pregnancies. So the question that I had asked you, what do you tell your patients? I'm asking because I'd really like to know. I have patients who come to me pregnant with myriad of conditions. That's what I do. Some are diabetic, some are hypertensive, some have an issue with their pregnancy. So high-risk doctors address the needs of a mom who may have a disease or be at risk for a disease, as well as a fetus that may have an issue. The mom may present with an illness or a cold or some kind of an infection, and then she asks me for the drug and to fix it. And this conference, for me personally, is important because I'm stuck with, I shouldn't give her an antibiotic because that's bad for her microbiome. I'm trying to tell her to eat more healthfully or to make better choices at home, but my patient is a Native American woman who lives on a reservation, and there's little electricity or fresh water for her. And there's not a grocery store nearby. So sometimes I give her the antibiotic because I know at least that that is the fix for her during that particular period of time. Now, often I have another woman who's in front of me who, may be much like the room, more, middle class, upper middle class, better educated, have more resources available to her. She also presents ill, sick, wanting the antibiotic. And I say to her, well, maybe you don't need the antibiotic. And she says to me, well, my children's pediatrician just gave my kids the antibiotic. I have the same thing. I want the antibiotic. And then I discuss with her the reasons why perhaps we should wait. She's pregnant. She has the resources to go get better food, better rest, water, other things. She's demanding the antibiotic. And then she says to me, your partners would write the antibiotic for me. That's true. That is the reality of what clinicians have to deal with on a daily basis. So now I'm spending time, and I feel like I'm arguing with my patient about what I believe truly to be in her best interest. My other patient, I am sorrowful and sad and despondent because I have no resources for her. That is something that we haven't discussed here, which I strongly encourage all of you to do, is not only vote with your dollar, but vote. Actually go to the polls and vote. Because it's the people who are making our policy decisions that will affect some of the people who can't make choices like the second woman I've described. The other piece of information that you all need to appreciate about what's happening on the clinical side is that people write reviews on me now. So that same patient that I've described probably wrote the worst review I've ever received on Vital Smarts on how horrible I was as a physician for not treating her with an antibiotic.
Can I just respond to that? Because I everything that Monique just said is absolutely true and are things that I've experienced. But, and I don't have a solution for you for those. But two observations. One is that before I talked about how relationships are actually so important in all of this. And we heard that from the previous panel as well, that regulations only get you so far, but it really is this contract between the eater and the farmer that makes you trust the food and makes you actually know that the practices that farmer, she or he is doing, regardless of whether they have a certified organic sign overhead, are ones that are ethical and are keeping the land healthy and keeping their community healthy. And it's actually the same thing in medicine. We've lost all the relationships there, too. There's lots of research that shows that if you tell a patient, look, I'm here for you, and if you need that antibiotic, just call me and I'll give it to you, or even better yet, I'll put the prescription into the pharmacy, but don't go get it. Just, you're going to get a magical cure just by having it there and knowing you can go get it. It's amazing how much that actually decreases the amount of use of antibiotics, and that's been studied, well studied at this point, that having that relationship is very, very powerful. I'm sure most of you in the room have been in that situation where you've had a conversation with a healthcare provider and planned to defer, but they're there to back you up if you develop this symptom or that symptom. But it also means that you can't be afraid of, terrified that someone's going to sue you at every turn. And it also means, all of these other things. And so the floor of medicine, the bottom, cover your ass kind of medicine is give it, these things for everything. Because no one's going to come back and sue you in 10 years when your child has asthma and allergies because they were given so much antibiotics as a child. So there has to be, once again, I'm beating a drum here, but this really massive shift in how we think about these systems, including relationships and so on.
Yeah, so following up on that, I just want to briefly talk about how I got interested in antimicrobial resistance. Back in 2011, my One Health colleagues and I got an email from an irate veterinarian who was accusing the medical literature of being biased, always blaming the farm animals for the rise of antimicrobial resistance. And I thought, wow, that's kind of interesting. I'm always interested in the politics of these subjects. So there seemed to be a blame game going on between the physicians pointing fingers at the veterinarians as to, who's to blame. The veterinarians were blaming the physicians. Who's to blame for the rise of antimicrobial resistance? So I took 5 years poring over government data, particularly interested in what happened in Europe, because Europe was a very interesting case study compared to what happened in the United States. And just very briefly, there's this one bug that drove European policy, and that's called VRE bug. And it's the short term for vancomycin-resistant Enterococcus faecium. Now, I know that's a mouthful, so that's why I'm just going to call it VRE. VRE is a very concerning bug because it was resistant to one of our last-ditch drugs, vancomycin, which is one of the heavy guns that we would use to treat this bug. When it appeared in hospitals, people started blaming the farm animals because the farm animals were getting this drug that was chemically similar to vancomycin called avoparcin. And this was taking place in Europe. And then they started finding VRE on the farms. So this was particularly in Denmark. Denmark the farmers decided that they would stop using avoparcin and then they would stop using all growth-promoting antibiotics. Now, when they did that, the VRE rates on the farms plummeted by 90%. But unfortunately, in the hospitals, the VRE rates kept going up. So something weird was going on. The European Union decided to ban all growth-promoting antibiotics, including avoparcin, in the late 90s. And unfortunately, they didn't collect VRE data from the farm animals, but if you looked at the data from the hospitalized patients, VRE rates were all over the place. They were very low in the Scandinavian countries where they're very judicious in antibiotic use. And then in some countries like Ireland, it just skyrocketed. I mean, they were going up and down all around, no consistent pattern whatsoever. And you would have expected it to all be low if it was all related to what was going on in the farms. Now, in the United States, we never approved avoparcin, not because of concerns about antibiotic resistance, but because of concerns about carcinogenicity or cancer-causing products. And yet, and when they collected data of VRE on farm animals, zero. There was no VRE in the farms. Nevertheless, there was tremendous amounts of VRE in the hospitals. So 10,000 people were getting VRE infections. So what was going on? This disconnect. Here in the US, you had huge VRE problem in the hospitals, zero VRE on the farms. In Europe, you had problems with VRE on the farms and in the hospitals, but when they banned the drugs, the farms went to zero, but the VRE stayed in the hospitals. Well, it took whole genome sequencing to finally figure out what might have been going on. Because what we do when we track these resistance genes, it's like looking at the genes for hair color. Let's say I put in a whole bunch of redheads in a room. They all have red hair, but you're trying to figure out how they're related to each other based on their hair color. You simply cannot do it. Yes, they all have the genes for red hair. It doesn't mean that they're all part of the same family. And that's what we've been doing with all of these antibiotic-resistant genes and bugs, is we've been trying to track them just based on the little snippets of their genes rather than their entire genome. Well, when the cost of sequencing an entire genome became cheap enough to do, they started doing that, and they did it with VRE. And it turns out that one clone, VRE CC17, was the one that was causing all the hospital outbreaks around the world. The genetic precursor appeared to come from a single animal, but not the farm animals that we thought. The animal came from a dog. The dog was ampicillin-resistant Enterococcus faecium CC17. So what that means is we're always blaming the farm animals, but in this case, it looked like it was dogs. And companion animals have been completely ignored in our entire conversation about antimicrobial resistance, and yet we share our homes with them, we kiss them, we sleep with them, we share our food with them, we share our microbiomes with them. They get sick, they get antibiotics. They get a lot of antibiotics, and when you go to the veterinary medical conventions, they're discussing that. They're concerned. We don't do any surveillance of companion animals, and yet they are a huge part of our life. So we have to do whole genome sequencing to truly understand the epidemiology, the ecology of these microbes, to know where they're coming from and how they're spreading, rather than making assumptions that might simply not be true.
So we can still blame the veterinarians, you're saying?
Well,
okay?
I'm not blaming the veterinarians, but, you know.
Just to echo one point there, that's actually something I think that I joked about earlier, right, that the bacteria that grow in yogurt, they don't grow in people. The same thing happens in the lab. I can't colonize a mouse with human microbes. It's not an easy thing to do. It doesn't want to. Same thing in people. Your microbiome is actually an incredibly stable ecology. It's a fascinating question about where does that come from? And it's not as obvious as people think. Perturbing that microbiome, introducing a new bug, manipulating it is very, very, very hard. That the bacteria, once they've evolved to be there in you, they're in this beautiful party, and they don't like outsiders. So there's a lot to understand about how these bacteria get there, where they come from. And, from an antibiotic resistance standpoint, in the VRE story, a lot of VRE, right, we see it in patients who undergo stem cell transplants. And what's insane is if you actually look, and these patients are obliterated with antibiotics and immunosuppressions, VRE becomes almost 100%, literally 100% of their microbiome. So there's certain bacteria that thrive during these massive perturbations, and VRE is definitely one of them. So it's a lot to understand about what is the microbiome, how does it become stable, and how is it transmitted.
Yeah, this other study found that cat owners were 8 times more likely to have MRSA in their homes than people without cats. So, our home environment is usually something that we ignore as well. So,
May I ask a question about antibiotic resistance, just for people? Is it bad to have an antibiotic resistant organism in your environment or in your system? I mean, if I went and tested the walls over here and it was MRSA, should we all just get up and run out of the room?
So the majority of healthy people, actually, a lot of the problems with antibiotic resistance organisms, and this is a microbiology concept, is oftentimes they're not as fit. So the organism in the context sometimes of acquiring antibiotic resistance may not always be as virulent. Sometimes it's more virulent. But most people, when they're exposed to MRSA, they actually clear it. The issue has to do a lot with patients who are incompetent or have immunosuppression. That's where antibiotic resistance becomes a huge problem. It comes back to, I think, and I couldn't agree with you more, about when a patient's in your office, a conversation in that relationship is everything. The vast majority of infections, either A, are not from bacteria, or B, even if they are from bacteria, you don't need anything, right? Your body will do a damn good job of fighting it. But it's in these specific patient populations where you run into problems. So, MRSA, yes, if it's on the wall, it's a big deal. It happens to be one that most people will clear on their own. Okay. So you don't necessarily get colonized. But what we worry about are places like hospitals where patients are immunocompromised, and then it has a chance of spreading like wildfire, and the consequences of it are grave.
Yeah, I just want to caution us, because I know that antibiotic resistance, it's becoming the flashy conversation in the room now, but it's the tip of the iceberg of a much bigger problem, which is this thing that we've been talking about, this loss of diversity and loss of biodiversity, which is the much deeper, larger, more far-reaching issue that all of us are dealing with, and that certainly is, when we're seeing, for example, epidemic rates of asthma and allergy and eczema in young kids, or a lot of the non-communicable chronic disease in older folks, everything from diabetes to heart disease to depression belongs in that category, to various kinds of cancers. These are not things that one can relate back to antibiotic resistance. These are things that can be in some form traced back to a loss of biodiversity and a loss of a functional immune and inflammatory response because of this idea that we are losing so much of our invertebrates, but also other kinds of species in the environment as well. And that is not just from antibiotics. That's from, there's a mass kill-off going on in both the micro and macro level there. So just to once again pull it back, I think that our health is being harmed so much more by this loss of biodiversity in general than just specifically antibiotic resistance.
Well, Dr. Miller, what would you say from your point of view, or from what you're teaching your residents, medical students, is there something that you think is causing or could be causing or contributing? Is there something that that you tell them to, okay, why don't you add this to your practice going forward?
So are you talking just about clinical practice? Because I feel the role of a clinician is far more, that extends far beyond the one-on-one encounter in that room. I see that people who are in healthcare need to be advocates for their communities and doing things, you know, in policy and public health and other things as well. But within the exam room, when you're having a clinical encounter, sometimes that can be hard to do, and it has everything to do with discussing things that are more related to lifestyle and nutrition and eating well, and you know, having. I personally feel that loneliness is the greatest greatest cause of disease and loss of biodiversity on the planet. It can be traced back to that. So combating loneliness, if you want to get very meta about this, but outside of the clinic room. And you know, obviously there are these very vulnerable these points that are sort of points where you can make a huge difference, like in infancy or pregnancy, or you know, I find also with the very elderly as well. Those are areas where you can really make a huge difference, both in terms of microbial health, but general health by manipulating these things. But outside of the clinic encounter, I feel is where we really can have the biggest effect. We know that it really is through environmental change that we can impact the greatest number of people and keep them healthy, and not necessarily by trying to do behavior change and interventions just within the clinic. So.
And just to follow up on that in terms of the environmental component of this, the environmental component of antimicrobial resistance is huge and profound, because it appears that antimicrobial resistance genes are ancient and they are everywhere. Now, we often don't know what goes on in the soil because they're hard to grow in the laboratory. And so some scientists came up with this really clever strategy of extracting DNA directly from the soil. Now, they don't know which bugs they came from, but nevertheless, they found resistance genes in the Arctic, in the Antarctic, in places that have never received any human anthropogenic exposure. So these resistance genes are natural. And by what we are doing is by blasting the environment with all of our manure and antimicrobial wastes, the bacteria are very nicely sharing these resistance genes with each other to protect each other from the onslaught that we're doing to the environment. And we are increasing the expression of these genes, so they are doing this much faster than we can develop new antibiotics. And again, as I said, we are working against nature rather than with it, and nature is winning because, you know, we can't fight the microbes. We have to use nature to live with them. So it's not a new phenomenon that's just since the beginning of our use of antibiotics. It's always been there.
Okay, I think everyone's had an opportunity to say a few things. How about we open up the conversation to our room? Martha, would you like to say something?
Well, a couple of things on antibiotic resistance in the environment. Most antibiotics come from bacteria and fungi. You know, if you know the history of penicillin, it came from a fungus. And these are single molecules that have been identified from bacteria. So bacteria make just about everything.
And chemotherapeutics.
And chemotherapeutics. You can look up, there's a researcher in Japan who spent his entire career of 45 years identifying molecule by molecule from the microorganisms. So, of course, these are in widespread use in the environment, and they are signaling molecules between bacteria, and the bacteria that are the antibiotic producers are naturally resistant to that. So what you do when you expose an environment to a particular class of antibiotic is you select for a particular genus, or, you know, on the phylogenetic tree of organisms, you select for those organisms that are resistant to that antibiotic. And so then then you can get endogenous production of it. I mean, it's a very complex thing. So I just want to point that out. It's not simple. The other thing from a medical practice standpoint that I think is difficult for physicians today, 50 years ago, we all grew up in the same hometown. Our physician knew our family was probably our family's doctor, our parents' doctor. So they knew our family history. They knew our environment. They knew our economic status. They knew all of these things that they don't know about us anymore.
They also shared in it.
And they shared in it. And so now you have a physician who's put in a position and they have 7, maybe 15 minutes, if you're lucky, to spend some time with you. They have no visual picture of your life. And when you're talking about a complex system, what we have in our health today in the United States and around the globe probably, but definitely here in the United States, is a systemic cascade of collapse. And it started a long time ago in someone's life, but they're now sent to 7 different specialists, and so no one knows the whole story. And so I would suggest that from a medical practice and trying to find a way that we can come back to some tool, some way that there's a simple way for a patient to present their life story in a visual way to a doctor so that in that 7 minutes they could see it. It's just a thought.
I think that's probably the subject of a whole other conference. But just to sort of come back to, because I think that you made a great point earlier about pulling back from all this antibiotics. Antibiotic resistance or antibiotic production isn't even just tied to antibiotics. So one way we do it in the lab is through nutrients, right? So, people were talking about, using aluminum as opposed to something else, but aluminum can absolutely induce, and one way we do it is through iron, and that these idea of bacteria and fungi and, they're responding to environmental cues. A lot of those are nutrient-based, a lot of those are mineral-based. So it isn't necessarily just about, antibiotics and how we do it. And I agree, that there's a tremendous challenge on physicians to build a relationship, to understand their patients' needs in a very global way, and to do it in way shorter amount of time. And I think that there's also an aspect of patient education that's different. And so I think learning how to meet that, but not succumb to the worries about being sued and this and that, and to make sure that we're still holding up what is the responsibility of the physician in that setting of being responsible is important. But I do think this idea of the interaction of everything and how nutrients are playing into this and how environment, we are part of the microbiome and we are changing it. The question is understanding how all these systems are coming together and how that does lead to things such as these non-communicable illnesses, I like that term, or the rise of antibiotic-resistant organisms and things like that.
I just want to say there is a lot of interesting innovation going on out there too, though, especially in agriculture. I'm seeing. A couple of months ago, I was on a conventional dairy farm in near Fresno in California. Very big farm. It was something that I think most people most people would call this, that 4-letter word, CAFO dairy farming, and that it was a lot of cows kept under a roof. But it was exactly as you were saying, in that this was actually a very principled farmer who was running a very organized operation. And I was learning a lot about innovation that he was bringing in, including the fact that he was cover cropping and moving more to conservation agriculture to grow the feed for his animals. But one of the most interesting things he was doing was he had tags on all of his cows' ears. You're probably familiar with this. And they all are connected to his iPhone. And all the veterinarians in the room know. And he has found that he is able to predict mastitis or uveitis is what it's called when they get which is sort of endometritis in humans when they get their uterine infection. He's able to predict it 5 to 7 days earlier than he used to when he was just using his clinical skills. And he's drastically cut down on the antibiotic use in his animals, and usually catches it early enough that he does give them herbs, which is kind of interesting in this big dairy farm. But because even conventional dairy farmers have to cull an animal if it's on antibiotics, which is something a lot of people don't realize. They have to pull them out of the herd until they're actually, in some form have no trace of it anymore in their milk. So I feel like things like this need to happen too, where even within the conventional system that we have to start to think of these fixes, to start to tweak at it.
I have a question about similar innovation happening on the human medicine side. So in veterinary medicine, we have been transplanting the microbiome from healthy cows to sick cows since before I went to vet school. And there are actually farms that have done surgical procedures on healthy cows to create a window to allow them to collect GI contents. And we knew we had to move it within 20 minutes to keep the bacteria alive, and we had to keep them warm and happy while we did it. And I know that some of that's being done in human medicine, and I think people in the room might want to hear about that. And a corollary to that is, are there any other lessons we can learn from different medical practices in other countries? I was shocked at one point in my early medical career to learn that in Europe, they don't cut out people's appendixes very much when they have appendicitis. You know, I had family members that had appendicitis, they had surgery, and they were better. And that in another country, they were giving them antibiotics. And are we even rethinking that? Because now we're worried about giving them antibiotics, and maybe surgery is a better.
Well, thanks for bringing up about the fecal transplant. So apparently in veterinary medicine, they'd been doing fecal transplants for over 100 years. You know, if a horse had chronic severe diarrhea, they'd stick a tube in its rectum and attach it to the rectum of a healthy horse, and you get the flow of manure from the healthy to the sick, and lo and behold, you'd get a cure. Well, there wasn't really an interest in clinical medicine for that because, well, there's the ick factor, and nobody really wanted to get somebody else's fecal matter. But now with C. difficile, with Clostridium difficile infections that are becoming resistant to vancomycin, they are now starting to do fecal transplants from healthy people to sick people, and pretty successful rate of cure. I mean, like, what, 80,
phenomenal when it works.
90%?
So-
Yeah.
It turns out you can give them by stomach tube as well. They don't have to go by enema. And in our hospital, they're referred to as crappuccinos.
So fecal transplant. So the people who do fecal transplants in general have a very good sense of humor. There's a couple interesting things to understand, though. C. diff is unique, okay? And the other thing is you don't even have to give live bacteria, and these things seem to work. So, the idea that we're actually transplanting a microbiome is probably incorrect. It only seems to really work in C. diff. C. diff is an so C. diff, for people who don't understand, this is a bacteria that up until fecal transplant happened was actually an immunologic problem. So I'm not that old, but I'm old enough to know at least the fecal transplant story. And so, this is a bacteria that oftentimes are associated with people who are in the hospital or they get exposed to antibiotics. There's some perturbation to their microbiome, and this toxic bacteria can emerge and cause a very severe and in some cases life-threatening infection of the intestine. Babies all have C. diff. Even though babies poop a lot, for those of you who've had a baby, they're not actually infected, right? They're colonized. What does that mean? When we looked in C. diff patients who kept getting C. diff over and over again, until we came up with this idea of transplanting feces, we were actually treating them with things like immunoglobulins. We were actually trying to restore their immune response to C. diff. And there's actually a lot of patients I'll see in my clinic who are still colonized with C. diff but not infected. So it again becomes this really interesting story about other microbial cues that might be keeping these bacteria in check. The host response to these bacteria is shaping a specific environment for that. And then this idea of fecal transplant, really fascinating thing that happens, and I don't know if this data is published or not, and the person who's doing it will probably kill me right now, but when you actually transplant feces from someone else into a new person, and you look at the bacteria that person had prior to their C. diff infection, the bacteria that engraft, which is a kind of a weird thing to say, are actually almost identical to the bacteria they had before. That their bodies select from that transplant the bacteria that they had actually seen in the past. And that's a really fascinating concept.
veterinary meeting where...
1 second, could you wait? Thanks.
Okay. I went to a recent veterinary meeting, or a few years back already, where they did the transfer from one cow to another cow, healthy cows, and within a month, they were back to what they originally had on the bugs we can identify.
So I just have a question. What do you think is going on there? Do you think it actually is somehow just releasing a microbial memory that or there are these little tiny colonies that are there but barely making it, and somehow it gives them permission to come back? I mean,
I think it's probably both.
Right.
But again, what's interesting is then this is also the way that politics involves the medicine, right? So what is a fecal transplant is also a phenomenal thing. People started talking about this idea of intellectual property earlier, and I trained in Boston, and there was all this really hardcore liberal intellectual property and patents. Oh my God, you're evil! But actually, this is a really important thing to understand, and this is really what drives innovation until we want to change the way our societies are structured. So fecal transplant was something that you can't actually regulate, right? I can take a poop and you can transplant it if you want to, because that's really all we do. So what happened was when we started to understand that fecal transplant could work for C. diff, and then the government started to come around, they actually started to say that, you know what, we're going to actually regulate this because this is a drug. And so it's going to fall under the FDA, and therefore anyone who gets a fecal transplant needs an IND. But the big studies were already published and showed that it was effective and life-saving. So patients, which was amazing, rallied, went to their politicians, that's a theme I think we're hearing today, and said, you can't do this. And not only that, but the FDA recognized that they can't stop that. Now, fecal transplant for any other indication does actually still require that you go through all the regulatory stuff. But fecal transplant for C. diff at this point is sort of fallen outside that. But what happened, coming back to your point, was the fact that it didn't have that regulation, we didn't actually get a chance to ask these questions. We didn't actually get a chance to follow the scientific process to its logical conclusion as to, well, what makes this work? Because the cat kind of, I hate the metaphors, whatever. But everybody knows what I'm going to say. And that's not a bad thing, but you can actually see that, sometimes these regulatory systems that everybody wants to it's so easy to doubt and say, oh, they're corrupt and horrible. They're not really that bad. You just have to understand who's calling what shots and to be an intelligent consumer, whether you're a scientist, a physician, a patient, a farmer, a bug on the ground, whatever.
But wouldn't it be nice to trust our systems a little bit more? In any case, I think we have more comments from the room. Would you like to say something, gentlemen? Yeah. Question, go ahead.
How have you, as practicing clinicians, how have you changed your practices with what you discovered? I mean, specifically for you, I'm curious if you know that some might give you a bad review because you didn't give them antibiotics. I mean, for me, that'd be something that I look to see that this is a doctor who doesn't want to give them. That'd be more of interest to see how they approach something. And knowing that there's not very clear signs on certain probiotics or certain prebiotics, would you still recommend, yes, you should have your inulin-containing foods and you should still eat yogurts and your sauerkrauts because that might help offset some of the side effects of this? We don't know for sure, but at least try these things and things of that sort.
So that's a great question. I tend not to read the reviews. Actually, someone brought this to my attention, this particular one. But I will honestly tell you, it's always in the back of my mind. They have also changed our payment structures. So most physicians are employed now, and they're employed by hospital systems that track how many infections are associated under your name, how many cesarean sections are associated under your name, how many reviews are associated, 3 or 4, whatever. And physicians will, change their practice as a result. It's unfortunate, but it really does happen. For OB specifically, legally, I'm responsible for whatever I've done for 18 years. I can get sued all the way up until that point of time. There's a huge difference in my practice from when I was a medical student to I'm now, but I'm still responsible for everything that has happened going forward. I truly believe that most physicians really want to do the best thing by our patients and really want to incorporate the most innovative medicine that's available to give our patients. And for me personally, I actually do tell patients, if I give them an antibiotic, why don't you try eating something more organic, or why don't you try some kombucha or something along those lines. I often tell patients to increase the amount of natural yogurts in their diet. I will tell patients, who, I've even told a patient who refuses, medications to try a yogurt for a particular vaginal infection, because I'm willing to go there with patients. But, I'd like to think that's true for most of my colleagues, but I don't know that for a fact.
To clarify, your hospital frowns upon C-sections, or they just track it as a general?
No, so all cesarean sections are tracked now. So you all are probably very aware of the fact that around the world, our cesarean section rates have climbed astronomically. In South America, for example, there are countries where the rate is as high as 46 to 50%. Oh, yes. And a safe rate is seen somewhere at about 15%. The vast majority of hospitals in the United States fall about the 30% range. There are a few that are still much higher than that.
Voluntary C-sections or?
No, overall, cesarean section rate. No, so, pardon?
For any reason.
For any reason, correct. So voluntary rates are very different and are not really tracked in that way. Certain populations will prefer a primary elective cesarean section, as we call it, but for the most part, C-sections are done because it's a repeat cesarean section. The woman has had a prior section and it's deemed safer, or for medical reasons, or for cephalopelvic disproportion, which is basically an arrest of labor. Labor gets so far and then it does not go any further.
I would say that climate change is polling really high these days with patients. Mm-hmm. It turns out that a lot of people are actually more likely to change their behaviors because of climate change than because of their personal health. So, I just go for whatever's, flashy and catchy and the next big thing when I want to talk about the same issue. So you can talk about, eating fruits and vegetables because it's going to make you healthier. I mean, the only exception being if they're pregnant. If they're pregnant, then they will do, because they're for a while eating for somebody else. It's like your microbiome, except it's even bigger, and you're going to have to pay for college for it, But climate change, I'm finding these days, is a great way to open a conversation. I don't know if you guys have done that. And to start to talk about things like you could buy these more ethically raised fruits, vegetables, or animals because it's great for you, or, do you want your grandchildren to be in a planet that's burning, And actually, that's the one, just doing my own testing, that seems to be the one that's working more these days, so.
Yeah, San Francisco.
Yeah, no,
okay, I think
they asked for our personal experience. I'm just telling you, it's polling very high these days.
There's some more questions. Do you have a question or comment? Question?
It's a question.
Okay, great.
We're talking about antibiotic resistance. If you have a high level of antibiotic resistance in a hospital, it's going into the sewer. The sewer is going to process that. The sewer plant is like a big stomach. You get a lot of gene transfer. That is then converted into recycled water. It goes on to the local lawns for the municipality. Are you, as physicians, even aware of that that revolving door that is happening? And if you are, how do you deal with it?
Don't grow a lawn. I mean, I talk about things like that with my patients. Why do you have a lawn? It's an opportunity for glyphosate and wasting water and, increasing seasonal allergies because you have a monoculture out front. Grow a diversity of fruits and vegetables, and if your city ordinance makes you grow a lawn, then go and fight that. Yeah, sort of thinking of the next layer of the problem.
I don't know how to answer that question because I don't think that we have that information. I think that the purpose of what we're doing right now is how can you integrate those sciences, right? That we can understand, and there's a lot of money and investment and time into tracking the spread of antibiotic resistance within a hospital. There's a lot of time and effort spent in terms of understanding how to develop new drugs to combat that antibiotic resistance. But where does it come from? We heard about pets earlier. What happens when that waste from a hospital, which is usually pretty tightly regulated? I don't know that the hospitals are flushing biohazards down the sewers, but are they, right? I mean, these are things where, again, I think that I'm a big skeptic sometimes with sequencing things, but I think that this is a situation where sequencing is incredibly helpful because it allows you to track really specific organisms and how they're transmitted through the environment. The second thing I'll say, which is another call for this interdisciplinary work, was another thing that someone said earlier, which is that there's very little standardization of our methods for the assessment of this, right? And the dissemination of information publicly. So genetic sequencing. If you go to genetic sequencing data sets, you know how many times the same goddamn bacteria has been sequenced? 1 billion times, because people aren't sharing, right? They're reproducing resources that are our resources. These are our public funds. And the other thing is that the methods they're using are impacting that outcome. How did you collect your sample? What machine did you sequence it on? How did you assemble it? These are all things that are going to affect the data. Because guess what? The human microbiome had 10,000 unique bugs inside of it until they realized it was sequencing error. Now it has 120. Okay? So this is an important thing to understand. It's an important thing why we have to cross disciplines to start sharing information.
And Ubiome, which was an independent company that just went bankrupt, they found out that most of their samples were baby poop and pets. So
I think we have. I think we have time for a few more questions. There's 2 there, and I believe there's 1 here, and I think that will be a wrap for this afternoon.
Okay, my name's Kim, and I told you earlier I work in healthcare as a chaplain. And so now I'm out of the big Boxwell University Hospital, and I'm working in a senior living community, very nice campus in Lower Westchester, and we have independent living, we have assisted living, we have rehab, we have nursing home. So I'm curious, because you said something about loneliness. This triggered me wanting to have this question. Your opinions as physicians, and considering our conversation here and trying to be multidisciplinary and life-giving, what are the 3 things that you would like to see happen in nursing homes to make the lives of our older seniors who know this is kind of their waiting station a better place?
Friends. Everybody needs friends. So, I think this is something that's just been echoed throughout this conference. We need to start thinking as a community as opposed to individually. Somehow or other, we've lost our ability to think about our neighbor. I mean, how many people know their neighbors these days? I remember my mother taught me when I was a kid, somebody new moved into the neighborhood, you brought them something, you knocked on the door and you said hello. That I can't tell you how many of my friends that doesn't happen to anymore. So that would be my response.
I guess this is like the human microbiome in a true sense, right? All of our connections to each other. So, I mean, it's a really profound question. I wish I could say it's in my area of expertise. I'm a New Yorker, so I tend not to talk to anyone, right? You just walk by everybody and don't say hello because they're going to steal something from you. But yeah, she's from California, where everybody says hello, and it's supposed to be really nice, but really they're not nice. But actually, I totally agree with that answer. I really believe people are good, and I really believe that we shouldn't walk by people, and if you say good morning to somebody or hello to somebody, it goes a long way to making the day happier. So, I think that there's a societal answer to you, which is we should go nursing homes more. We should integrate them more. It shouldn't be that people are, oh God, I was going to make the electric fence joke. But like, they've been herded, right? And that's crazy. And there should be an apex predator, I guess, driving them out back into the world so they can integrate and not stay stagnant. But yeah, I don't have a great answer for you.
I've seen and more photosynthesis for sure. Yeah. Just being out in the sunshine. I visited an amazing project in the Bronx a couple years ago, which was just these community garden projects, but they put them right next to the elder housing, and it was amazing. People just started pouring out of their high-rises, people who hadn't been outside in years, to start gardening together. And then it started to generate, these little card playing and more physical activity. People started getting more vitamin D because they were outside. They were actually growing healthy vegetables. There were actually some micro enterprises that grew out of it. There was one lady that was selling spices and another one enchiladas because, they built the gardens and she didn't have a real source of supplemental income before that. So I actually am a big believer in plants and sun and soil to heal people and get them to come back together into communities. And lawns don't do it. They just don't. Yeah, they're just for sewage. I agree. We really should get rid of all the lawns.
There's also a political answer there too, which is the cost of healthcare, right? That a lot of people end up in these facilities because the cost of healthcare later in life drains their bank accounts. They have no other choice. This is where they're forced into. Home care is incredibly expensive, to keep people in their houses. And, I think that there are cultural phenomena too. You go to a lot of other cultures, not here, and, you have multiple generations living in the same house. But I think that part of that burden comes back to the original point about just the cost of healthcare being tremendous.
If you still have a youth group in your church, take the kids. It's a win-win on both sides.
You just hit on a big thing. If you still have a youth group. The kids are not in church these days. They are in the synagogue.
Yeah, and you need providers, whether they're physicians, nurse practitioners, whoever, who practice slow medicine for everybody, but especially for elder folks, which is really familiar with the idea of slow medicine. It sort of follows the slow food movement. One of the big principles of it is actually sitting on your hands, so that they can't prescribe stuff whenever you think about a drug, and believing that actually doing relationship building and some watchful waiting, and if anything, peeling back a lot of the drugs that are causing side effects, can actually create a lot more resilience and less frailty in old people. Frailty actually being something you can measure as the inability to bounce back after an illness.
But you need to... No, all I was going to say is that we as clinicians are really not the drivers all the time. Everybody sitting out here needs to take some responsibility for understanding that another drug doesn't always fix your issue. Really fixing your issue might be finding a friend or doing something else, going outside, taking a walk, something other than a drug.
Well, just the other day I'm sorry, if I could just tell a really short anecdote. I witnessed a man who wanted to get up out of his chair and go over and talk to his friend Bill, but he's a fall risk. Mm-hmm. So there was an aide right there who said, you can't get up. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I thought, oh my gosh. But this was in an Alzheimer's unit. They were known to have certain behavior. It was just so sad to me.
So I believe we actually, I'm sorry, have two more questions and then...
Here we go.
Hi, I've spent the last 3 years researching Lyme disease and maternal health. Mm-hmm. So I think certainly for three of you, I'd love to know this. One is I was pretty shocked when I came upon the jury out still on it, but research which pointed to the congenital transfer of Lyme disease, so via placenta between mother and child, the result being potential autism spectrum disorders and any number of syndromes and problems to the fetus, just like any disease, infection going between a mother and a child, rubella or into old age syphilis. So the questions that are related, one, if a woman came in with, it could be Lyme disease, but it could be any disease, which placed really significant risk to the fetus, developing a lifelong struggle of some kind. And the only thing you could do was offer them a course of an antibiotic to prevent that. Would you do that? Would it, question for you, would it then interfere with the babies, the fetuses developing microbiome? Because we already know it would affect the mother. And slightly separate of it, is there any way that the placental transfer have something to do with when you say there's such a rise in all these children having asthma? I forget the list that you think. Is it possible that all of this stuff is happening via placental transfer that we still maybe don't know how to control? Like if it isn't an antibiotic, well, what could you do to control it?
So I couch every single time I give a response in terms of treatment to patients with, this is the information we know in whatever year, 2019. In 2019, if I had a patient who presented to me with syphilis, which, by the way, is not that long gone anymore. It's
back.
It's back. It's very much
It's
back.
the new
We have
STD again.
yes, we have a
The new old
significant
STD.
population in southern Arizona. I would absolutely treat that woman with an antibiotic. And depending on the time period in which she knew that she received this infection, she may get several courses of that antibiotic. As to whether that will impact the fetus, certainly that fetus is growing inside her. In fact, there's some theories that may in fact impact that fetus's, if it's a female child, children, because the eggs are growing inside that child at that time. Now, do I know the degree to which it's being impacted? No, I absolutely do not. Do we know yet? No. Medicine changes. The more knowledge, this is what we're here for. We're here to learn, to learn, to learn, to learn. And I think probably the thing that we do understand the most is that we don't know.
So there is a lot of observational data, and correct me if I'm wrong, that it really is a dose-response thing, where, in the first couple years of life, which begins at some point in utero, we can argue about that, on into about age 2 or so, more doses, more rounds of antibiotics seems to be linked in some way to higher rates, specifically of asthma and atopic dermatitis. And that seems to be, at this point, hard to know, what is causative there? Is it that those same parents don't eat as much fruits and vegetables or don't get out in the sunshine as well? I mean, there are confounding variables, but it does seem like there's enough kind of laboratory data that matches up with epidemiologic data, which matches up with some short-term trials, experimental data, to support that idea. But with everything, we have to do a sliding scale of risk and a cost benefit. And if someone has a really serious infection that could be life-threatening to them or to their fetus, then obviously that tips the scales. And that sounds like that's what veterinarians are doing now too. You really are applying a sliding scale of evidence in terms of if it's a very mild kind of illness, then you're going to treat it with marigolds, and prayer. And if it's something that is, really serious, then all of a sudden antibiotics have value. And so that's where there isn't a one-size-fits-all. It really does have to be a discussion of risk and benefit in each instance.
Yeah, so I think there's important points here, right? We've heard a lot of people making a lot of statements, and a lot of the times this is correlative, right? Meaning that two things are occurring at a point in time, but you don't have causation. Antibiotic usage early in life, you can imagine, is a marker of a million different things. It could be a marker of affluence. It could be a marker of city living. It could be a marker of just the fact that you have tadpoles in your house. I mean, there's so many other confounding variables, which is what we call it in science, that can go with that. With that said, there's very convincing evidence about this idea of, again, how the microbiome develops. And that early in life, your immune system is plastic. No people have the same type of immune system. No people have the same microbiome. That you're developing until about age 4 or 5. Then you hit this set point. Your microbiome is incredibly stable, and then you get older, and it becomes incredibly volatile again, where it's allowed to be perturbed. So it was what I said earlier. If you try to like introduce a microbe into, a 30-year-old's body, it's very hard. But to do that at a 2-year-old is actually very easy. And a lot of work from people like Marty Blaser at NYU show that during this critical period, that would be an opportunity where if there was a causative relationship between some environmental perturbation. Now, that can be also the fact that you decided, well, peanut allergy is bad, so I'm not going to give my kids peanuts. Guess what? You should have given them peanuts, right? That we learned that you can't just remove something from a system because it makes intuitive sense. But I do think that there is something to be said for the fact that we are going to find out that this antibiotic usage early in life, I have a suspicion, is going to end up being a big problem.
But what about if a mother?
So the idea of the in utero microbiome is also something that's important to understand. This is, again, a problem of technology. When all of a sudden this study came out, they're like, oh, babies have a microbiome. I was like, that makes no sense. Babies are sterile. The fact that syphilis, the fact that rubella, these things can cause issues in babies, it's rare, right? There's very specific pathogenic organisms, and they're not being transferred across the placenta. They're invading, right? They're crushing you. That's why they're disease-causing organisms. They just published it. Yeah, guess what? It was lab contamination. How do you sample a baby's microbiome? You're covered in bacteria everywhere. That's all that happened there. Now, it doesn't mean that there may not be things there, but we have to be very careful with things that are coming out in fields that are still in their infancy. And especially something like DNA, right? We use this technique called PCR, which is a way we study DNA in the lab. It allows us to amplify DNA. It won a Nobel Prize because it's amazing what it did. But you know how much DNA you need for contamination to occur? 1 strand. That's why I won the Nobel Prize. So if there's even just like someone breathes near something, you will contaminate that. In my lab for PCR, we have like an area that's like, the biggest fortress ever to prevent contamination of that. So we have to be very careful before we jump too far with the literature and that it's evolving. So I don't know the answer to your question, but based on biology, I don't think that babies are really carrying a big microbiome. I think that's a protected environment. Now, vaginal delivery versus cesarean, absolutely, we see differences in that early microbiome. How does that translate to later in life? We're still trying to understand that.
Was there one more question?
And 2 brief comments. So the first one is that, as I said, it's still very early. Everything is more complicated than we think that it is. Most things are more complicated than we can conceive that they are today with what we know. And the idea that we're going to be able to find paths of causation through this complex systems biology, someday, I hope that's true, but that's not what we have today. I want to interject another voice, a little voice of hope here, which is I have worked with the FDA on bringing, it was the first live topical microbiome. It's still not all the way through, by the way, and there's no certainty it will get there. But the FDA has been incredibly helpful and cooperative and collaborative in trying to bring these things into the clinic. They recognize the complexity, and they are not out there to stop these things from getting through. They are not bad or evil. They're good scientists working hard, collaborating with companies, and this is an area where you should not let that discourage you with your future careers from trying to do something with this. I want to talk about it specifically with FMT, because when FMT came along, here it was, we had a pile of shit that was getting better than a 90% response in a potentially lethal illness and doing it in 72 hours. How many drugs in the portfolios of Big Pharma can do that? How many drugs in the portfolio of Big Pharma work as well as a pile of shit? Okay, but it's much more complicated than we think. So as this started to expand, and then it'll work for IBD and all these other things, as we said, the question of how to proceed, and they put a little bit of a barrier there, but at the same time, OpenBiome was creating defined consortiums, and if you wanted to become a stool donor for OpenBiome, and I love this, it's harder to become a stool donor for OpenBiome, to screen it to make sure it doesn't have diseases, than it is to get into Harvard. And I actually love what that says about both institutions. So there is real hope. People are working really hard on this, and if we can all come together as a community, collegially and collaboratively, we can approach this complexity. If we embrace the fact that it is going to be more complex and we have a sense of humility, there is great promise that what will come out of this is more health and less disease.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much, all of you, for being up here.
You can stay up. You can stay up there for a sec. So, thank you. We're nearing the end. We have one last panel, which is going to be not panel, and something Daphne said is really important. That day one, we sort of siloed the doctors, the soil scientists and water scientists, the animal and farmers, and we did that because we wanted to sort of provide some foundations. Tomorrow, we're going to have this period at the end of the day at 1 o'clock, in which we're going to have everybody up, and we're going to have a couple of moderators going and trying to bring groups together and get conversations going. And I hope that's really going to be fun. But we're going to do a little bit, a mini thing on that today. We have a health educator from Bard, Mark Williams Jr., and he graduated Bard last year, and he's teaching public health courses at some of our early colleges. And he's been meeting both with some Bard students and some early college students and teaching them some of your materials. And they've developed about 40 or so questions. We're not going to get to all of them. But I'd like to invite all the panelists who are here to come up, and we'll bring some chairs up. And some of the students are going to ask questions that we're going to try and engage some of the panelists on what they've said today and what they studied in their materials. So this will be a way to get some of the conversations going cross-disciplinarily as well. So I hope that's, and we'll go for about half an hour, and then we'll have dinner. We get the wireless mic up here too, so that we got two. Wireless in the line or a half
Squeeze it.
Just still moving that way? Sure.
Here.
That's all right.
How is it? Still. What's going to happen? I see more people on the panel than
All right, so are you ready to go? Should we get started now? All right, so hello everyone to the end of the aisle as well, and hello everyone here. My name is Mark Williams Jr. I'm a former BSEC student myself, and also Bard College graduate. I'm the Director of Equity and Inclusion and a faculty member in Health Education at BSEC Manhattan. So hello to all the BSEC Manhattan students who are looking at this, and the Bard College students, and to my students who did their homework and gave in these wonderful questions. So the students and myself, we've been thinking through all of your materials. We've read some of the papers that you've published. We've looked at some of your TED Talks. We really know a lot about you all, save for your social security numbers. We've created a set of questions, and these questions are open. Anyone can feel free to answer them. We want to get through as many questions as we can, and so as the person moderating this, I will not be shy about stopping you in the middle of, or at least in a reasonable end to what I think is a good enough answer. I'm going to say the first name of the student, and I just want to acknowledge that we had a lot of help from Professor Gabriel Perron, who was a part of the panel as a professor here and who is also back there. And a special thank you to the food microbiology course that he teaches, the metagenomics course that he teaches, and to the course between myself and my colleague, Dr. Collins, on big ideas in human health, disease, and development. And some of these students you will be able to meet tomorrow and today. So the first question is from Isabel. I watched a number of the pre-conference videos this morning, and I think the question that's sitting most prominently with me is more of an ethical/political one than a science one, which I hope is okay. It is okay, Isabel. Coming from a low-income household, and as someone who still struggles at times with grocery prices, I'm thinking a lot about actionable ways to support sustainable food economies without losing the ability to sustain myself. I feel really strongly about a movement against big agriculture and lobbying towards supporting small farms, small businesses, etc. But I think that in the same way that the lobby against big industry is a class issue, I also think there's a serious question to be asked about how we ask people as a whole to find ways to hold strong against these industries without endangering their and their families' abilities to eat. And I think it's hard to identify sometimes where your food is coming from and what is and isn't the right stuff to buy when you still, and I do still struggle to know, how to learn where my food is coming from. So I just want to start us there, because a lot of what we've been talking about, what I've been hearing, requires actionable steps. And when we think about the people who have attended this conference, in some way, they are able to make actionable steps to be healthy in ways that other individuals might not be. So when we think about farming, when we think about, having a healthy microbiome, what are those structural determinants that might get in the way of certain kinds of individuals, particularly low socioeconomic class individuals? What are those kinds of determinants that can be barriers for them to actually be able to do the things that we are trying to achieve? Yes.
Know what to eat and not to eat. That's a bit of a lesson that's difficult to learn sometimes, but I think it's important.
Yes.
Can I push back directly against that? I think that's, we have a tendency in this culture, being the United States, to blame individuals for things that are systemic problems. And if you don't have access to fresh, healthy food, it doesn't matter how much you know what to eat, you can't get it. And the evidence by far within low-income communities is that it is not because of a lack of knowledge, it's because of a lack of access. And so this is an issue of equity and access. It's an issue of changing our entire food system, so we're growing food and not just food-like products that feed animals and cars or that actually make us sick. It's changing, it's accounting for the true cost of food, so that the things that are, the people who are picking up the tab, which is the healthcare system, that they're actually passing that tab on to the agricultural production system. Within each bite of a processed food, we have to be paying for that diabetes and that hypertension that's happening down the road collectively as a culture in terms of the cost of that piece of food. And that will level the playing field in terms of food cost. All of a sudden, the carrots and the broccoli will look a lot cheaper and be more affordable. We also have to let communities build their own food systems. And I am not in a position to tell certain communities how to do that. They have to figure it out for themselves. And what we're seeing is amazing innovation happening across this country in very diverse communities and communities of color all over the place who are not taking a top-down approach to changing the food, but actually thinking about local food economies. And that is actually probably the most hopeful thing that's happening in our food system right now. We've seen it in Detroit with incredible changes that are happening there, and throughout the country, not just on the coast. So.
Thank you very much. So, in following along with this particular strain of social determinants and thinking about cultural politics, Scarlett has asked, or has said rather, I watched Food Betrayal, Don't Swallow the Lies, a TED Talk by Alan Lewis. In it, he describes the lies, big ag, and the food industry in general, who he refers to as the fiberati, tell to the American public. My question relating to this video is, how can we work to undo the elitist reputation that has come to surround the pursuit of locally sourced and ethically produced meat and the like? And is this reputation completely unfounded, or does it possess an air of legitimacy?
How about I answer that one?
Yeah.
I wanted to try to be careful to answer the question instead of pontificate on my 5-year-old TED Talk, which just hit 500,000 views. Using poverty as an excuse not to change our industrial food system is one of the great betrayals. And in this video, I point to this audience of 2,400 people in Boulder, Colorado, who are all affluent and all eat organic and all shop at Whole Foods or natural grocers. And I tell them, you are being called elitist by the industrial food system propaganda machine, the fiberati, in order to denigrate your values, right? But the fact of the matter is, guess what? Poor people deserve to eat well. And poor people, if there's such a thing, in my world, know how to eat well. It's not a question of knowing what to eat. It's a matter of access and about the economy. Well, our entire system that we're talking about includes community, includes family, includes individuals, includes education, includes access. And I think more than anything else right now, you're seeing the control of access to agriculture. And try to make this brief, with the new food safety laws, the new approach to food production, it's harder and harder and harder to be a smallholder producer, whether you're in your backyard or 10 miles away from New York City. And this is what I call the fiberati, because they don't want competition from smallholder agriculture. And fundamentally, the way to fix this is for a small agriculture to ally with consumers in the city. Consumers need clean food grown in a clean environment, but those farmers need the exchange, the social exchange, the community exchange, the food exchange, and the money. That is the overarching vision. I think it got lost today, but we can grow clean food largely without antibiotics and largely without synthetic fertilizers, but it has to change the underlying economic reality that has been built around the food system. Anywhere near to answering the question?
Well, yes, but I think there's also a question here about how we actually work to undo, I guess, the language that we are utilizing when we talk about these kinds of things. And so if anybody has any ideas about how we might do that, I think that would be
there's some
helpful.
practicality to it. It costs a lot of money to shop at Whole Foods and natural grocers. And, like it or not, not everybody has the same economic resources. That's why that language gets attached to certain things. I mean, it's a practical issue, and it's, certain designer brands have elitist attitudes, and they have an equitable price. I think we need to be careful when we talk about language per se, and instead of really just attacking the issue as it is. I mean, people can label what they want, right? But the fact is, some of our communities simply do not have access to good food. How do we get it to them? Or food that makes you feel good, food that makes you feel healthier, food that gives you more energy. How do we get it to them? I don't care if someone labels organic food elitist or not. I just want to know how to get good food to people.
I will say something that maybe isn't going to be popular, but is something that I see in my clinic. Education's a big deal. I remember seeing patients who would drink 4 liters of like regular soda every day and assume that was healthy. And what I would say is that I would much rather a person eat, this glyphosate stuff sounds horrible, but I would much rather somebody eat a well-balanced diet and understand the nature of the foods and what contributes to a lot of these problems than being able to shop at something organic. And I do think that there is an aspect of where they put these grocery stores, who they cater to, and making then people feel necessarily bad about the fact that they can't shop at them. When the reality is, I think that they're going to move the dial on the health curve a heck of a lot more shopping at what we've been calling today a bad grocery store than being able to shop in an organic store. That really, the mistakes that people are making that are leading to this obesity epidemic are much more profound than just getting organic produce. It's just my feeling.
I think another issue that kind of goes back to economic status. I think earlier in the day, one of the people mentioned learn how to cook, but you have to have time to be able to cook. And this is something that's also lost on, the economic status buys you time and leisure where, we have many people in this country who have to work 2 and 3 jobs to be able to put food on the table that's not really food. Mm-hmm. And I'm sorry, but it really touches me that we have these systemic issues and these people who have no power. And there are people in this room, or we have voices, we have some power. We need to do something with our power to help these people. We can't just say, we need to put we do need to get them access to the better food, but we also need to address the problem that even if they had access to better food, they probably wouldn't have the time to cook the meal.
Can I point out that these people is us? And that, you look at the NHANES data, and yes, in low-income populations, it's roughly 7% of the population is getting more than the 2 fruits and vegetables a day. But when you look at the U.S. in general, all incomes, it's 11% are getting more than 2 servings of fruits and vegetables a day. So we are just unhealthy as a country. And I think that, our work has to be really on not trying to single out specific populations. There aren't these people, it's us. We are doing something collectively that is really destroying our health and destroying our food system. And so it is actually very, very important for us to all think not in terms of, helping the other, but really bringing all of us up in shifting the food system. So.
Right. Well, thank you. That was. I thought that was a solid
difference between 7 and 11%. It's like pretty tiny.
Right. Thank you all for answering that question. I really want to make sure we get to all the other questions. So this question, actually, in picking up about education, this question comes from one of my students, Stanley. So Stanley asks, if the microbiome, and I'll even add something in for into this question as well, if the microbiome, including things about food access and vaccines and other sorts of things that we've been talking about today, are so significant to our health, why is it not more prominent in public media? Right? And I think it's an interesting question, and it's one that actually caused a lot of debate amongst the students between, well, is it? Who's this conference for, right? So when we think about education, where do we see representations of the microbiome? This seems to be a bit of an ivy or a elitist kind of conversation that might be missing some people, the people who we were just talking about. Yes.
Well, the bottom line is in the public media, you have to look at who pays the bills. And so if you can't patent it, you're not going to generate a lot of income potential, and therefore you're not going to put a lot of money into it. So many of the things that have been talked about today are not patentable things. They're general scientific information that people learn, hopefully through basic sciences as they come up, or through actual personal experience. And so the media really has to depend upon the money that comes in from their advertisers in order to put that information out. And if the money is not there, because most non-patentable things don't have a lot of extra money, that's public money, and a few of our university folks pointed that out, and I remember it was about 1952 when the United States changed formally where they were going to get money for research from a public funded pursuit of research to a privately funded system. And that's where the money comes from as far as putting information out on the media. So that's why we have to do things like this conference to get that out to schools, out through young people, out through other people that are doing things to collaborate and finally get that information out through the grassroots, if you will. And the benefit that we have today that we didn't have even 10 years ago is social media to get it out. We don't have to rely upon TV and various things like that because we have social media to get that information out.
It also depends on where you consume your media. So the microbiome is a big deal in the media I consume. But somebody who's 18 or 19 and entering college isn't getting the same media, and because it's such a complex issue, it's hard to put it into those 3-minute social media sound bites. And there's been a lot of research that show that a lot of young people don't delve into a lot of deep media issues until somebody like you makes them do it, right? And so we have to figure out ways to use the social media platforms to entice people, young people and old people who are relying more on the soundbite medias to think about some of these tougher topics that really are important for the whole world. And I don't have answers. It's just an observation.
Well, if you look at some of the social media platforms like Reddit, has a number of microbiome channels, and they actually get into some really lengthy discussions. Scientists pop in and out, and there's a kind of an ongoing dialogue. So if you're interested in the topic, you can go, if you're a Reddit consumer of media, you can go to Reddit and look at some of the different microbiome channels and see what some of the questions and discussions are, and you'll get from one end of the spectrum to the other. But that's sort of part of that mode of consumption, is looking at it all and kind of synthesizing it.
Also keep in mind that biome science is about 10 years old. 2008, there were 400 citations globally on the microbiome. 2016, it was 20-some thousand. I'll bet in 2019, it'll be over 100,000. You have 2 generations of doctors and researchers practicing right now who never received academic training in the biome. It is brand new. Last, really quick, is that Google and Facebook are deprecating all of this under the title of natural health. And if it's not fully fledged NIH or Harvard Science, it will no longer come up in the organic search. So you have this suppression at that level as well.
Well, I want to push back, though. It sounds to me like a lot of defeatist language. What can you all do? Right? Like, what can you do in your positions, right? Like, you are powerful people. I mean, you might not think you are powerful, but you are some of the leading figures in your field.
Well, a very simple but basic thing is I was on a curriculum design committee for our second year basic science part of the DVM curriculum at Cornell. And upon finally saying, I'm tired of going out and lecturing to human microbiome people when I'm actually in the veterinary college and our students don't see it. So for the last 3 years of my active professorship, I taught the microbiome early. In fact, we moved it up earlier and earlier in Block 4 so they could see that there were beneficial microbes, because we do case-based learning. So then there was a whole sequence of infectious disease cases going through all the major different animal species and the major pathogen and disease cases they would deal with and needed to know. But first, they got the fact that this is all in the context of there being microbiomes and all the species you're going to work with, and understand the balance, and that these things all go together as you approach helping these animals. So I think it's important, and I'd ask, we've got a lot of people in human medicine practice as well, in institutions. Do your students receive basic microbiome courses? I mean, or at least lectures that are just geared toward this is not an infectious situation necessarily in most people, but this is 99% of your genes and where we are. I think that's a very simple thing, but an important thing. If we're not teaching students, and ideally it moves down to undergrads as well, then we can't really expect even people 10 years from now to be receiving it in the same way.
One of the things is to answer that question, what are we doing? Well, I can speak for Don because I know he's not going to say much, but he travels around the world and has, since his retirement, like a bandit almost, speaking at every engagement he possibly can get, to every audience that will listen to him anywhere in the world. That's how the information is getting out there. It's through the grassroots level.
Well, I can tell you what I did, because I didn't come from this field, but when I saw the connection and I had this systems thinking, I started taking every resource I had, and I mean every resource I had, to get the message out, to meet these people. I call up scientists, I email people. I've read stacks and stacks and stacks of scientific papers, and I've used every dime I made in my prior career to make a company that will facilitate the interdisciplinary science with these people, so that all of science can start to look through the microbiome and see it as a lens to how we're all interconnected. So I put my money where my mouth is.
I'd like to say something on this subject. The way that I view it, having worked at US EPA, what I saw here that makes the question you're addressing almost irrelevant is that every municipality in the United States is putting sewage sludge in tons per acre out in the surrounding communities. Where does it go? It goes to economically and educationally disadvantaged communities. It doesn't matter if those families have food bought from some organic food source. When they put it on their table, there is visible amounts of sewage sludge containing every pollutant that is fat soluble, that causes everything from cancer to birth defects to neurological disorders on their tables. They cannot escape it. It comes through the windows. The research I did at EPA was to go around and visit these families, document what was happening there, the illnesses, and what we found was that this is a prevalent process today that is overshadowing everything else that we're trying to do. It cost me my job, despite Congress holding 2 hearings over my research and passing the No Fear Act, which is a joke. But what scientists can do, and I'm not saying just these scientists, is everywhere I went. Let me tell you what I said on my way out, my last day after 32 years at EPA, was a prominent scientist at EPA walked over, saw me in a restaurant, said that, You know, he congratulated me for Carol Browner, the EPA administrator, giving me an award for my research. And I looked at him and said, I just hope you continue the research I did. He looked at me and he said, no way, not after what happened to you. The core problem is here, we've got federal scientists looking at these problems at universities, at federal agencies across this country who sit in there and will take their government salaries, their academic salaries, and will not touch this issue because it'll cost them their jobs and they know it. So that, to answer your question, is what can we do? We can risk our jobs. And if enough of us risk our jobs to solve these problems, they will be solved. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you very much. And that actually leads perfectly into another question from another student, Ava. Ava asks, how has fear been utilized by both sides of the microbiome discussion? Or I wouldn't say both, all sides of the microbiome discussion to prompt/prevent action taken within the realm of this field, and especially as it relates to public health. And she's my student, so yeah. So that's who wants to tackle that one? Yes.
The funding of government agencies to look at these things is very much a fear issue. They will find all kinds of excuses not to deal with it. It's not in my jurisdiction. The regulations don't allow me to do that. If you want it done, go find a politician and change the law. So to get something up off the ground, you're going to have to run under the wings and push awfully hard because of that. The money is there, but it's not. And I run into this constantly, and it's just endemic. And what happened to David is just the tip of the iceberg.
Can we ask Don Huber to elaborate? Don?
Yeah, I can tell you what happens when you write a letter to the Secretary of Agriculture.
Please.
Tried to alert him to some concerns that a number of us had, still have. And then you find the industry representatives on the internet, a very personal, private letter hand-delivered to the secretary. I didn't even want to compromise it through the mail system, so I had that hand-delivered through the an intelligence courier. And then very shortly after that, you have all of the vindictive things coming up, calling you a fraud. And then finally, when that doesn't work, and of course I was retired so that they couldn't penalize me as they did with David or whatnot. But then becomes very vitriolic, so that then you have them asking for somebody to take you out, and then there's an accident. And so the sheriff says, you've got to wear a smaller target and move faster. And I survived that with a broken back and 6 broken ribs and a concussion and crushed lung and crushed kidney, a few other things. But you do what's right. And you still share. We've all got a vested interest. If not for our immediate situation, but we're an endangered species.
If anyone's wondering, Don's stories are true, they're supported, they're widespread, and any of us involved in this have to proceed very carefully, use encrypted email, and all sorts of strange things happen. This is not, And the things that I've heard about Don, we put him out to pasture. He don't know what he's talking about. This is the Fibrati working to marginalize his work, which is damning, to say the least.
Thank you for...
Anyway, I'm very honored to be here.
We are honored to have you. We have some students in the back who have questions. Yes.
Can I add one thing to the fear question?
Yes.
Because it's pervasive here. The fear that individuals don't have a voice, the fear that individuals can't understand science, the fear that individuals can't stand up to the healthcare system or the ag system. This is the endemic thing that we're trying to, that people are told that they do not have a voice. And my wife walked out on this whole thing today because she's been fighting for a voice in the medical system for years, and she wasn't, so many things were said that she felt were silencing her again. That's kind of the biggest fear. We need an uprising, and so many people that I know are, whether they have any education or at all, are smart about these issues, about nutrition and eating. They get it. They're savvy. But there is a narrative in play that individuals should not have a voice, even sometimes when they have advanced PhDs.
Thank you. Yes.
I have a question.
Say your name and...
I'm Shannon. I go to Bard. I'm an environmental and urban studies major. So this is kind of a niche question. I don't know if you talked to, I forget your name in the red shirt. What is it?
Alistair.
Okay, Alistair. Yeah, you talked about wastewater treatment plants using tertiary treatment to remove antibiotics from wastewater. And this whole time I've been thinking and writing about that because that really caught me. And I'm wondering if you had, or anyone on the panel had any experience with a wastewater treatment plant being able to remove antibiotics in a way that greatly reduces the amount coming out in effluent. And I was also wondering about bioremediation because someone brought up bioremediation of soil, and I'm wondering if anyone has tried that with water, wastewater. And also, going off of waste, I was wondering if anyone has thought of, or I was just thinking that if we are removing antibiotics from our wastewater, we can possibly be removing them from manure before spreading it over fields. And I'm wondering if anyone knows of anyone doing that or any technologies that have been used.
I'll talk to you later about it if you want. It's a long subject.
Yeah, I would love that.
Yeah, I mean, I can answer it quick. Again, we can talk later, but I mean, it really depends on the antibiotic. So antibiotics are quite a diverse range of molecules, and some are removed really well by even basic wastewater treatment plants. Others less so. But the tertiary treatments, I mean, I guess the real leaders in this are in Switzerland, where they're using chemical oxidation processes at the end of the plant to basically strip out everything that gets through the biological part. And I think now they've put tertiary treatment on all of their wastewater treatment plants in Switzerland. And we're now seeing the quality in terms of chemical contamination of the Swiss rivers. It was always good because they don't use chemicals as much as the rest of us. And they're much more sensible with the use of chemicals. But even what they were using, the levels in the rivers have gone down. And I think the ecology and the biodiversity, they're beginning to see improvements as well. So it can be done. But then the argument, when we say, well, we'd like to do that in the UK, the argument then is it's going to cost, so I converted dollars. Over 10 years, it would cost $35 billion in the UK to introduce the same level of treatment. And that's the question of whether that's a good use of $35 billion. because you could use it to solve some of the other project problems that we've been talking about. So it's tough, but in Switzerland they've done it, and they've done it well. Not to do it. Yeah, I mean, so I present that question to my students every year. So we have a debate where they each put different hats on, and so some are industry, some are water treatment guys, some are the NGOs, and we debate: is it worth $35 billion to treat out some of these molecules? And I think at the end of the day, I think what would happen is you would actually treat out everything that we're not measuring as well. So probably it would be a good use of money, and it would. I think the ecosystem service delivery would probably improve. So economically, it'd probably be in the long run a good use of money. And we've talked about One Health. Probably would improve health as well. It may help solve some of the diseases we see in the UK. But that's all guesses. You don't have the data to show it. But
from a cost standpoint, what's putting the antibiotics there in the first place and addressing that, I mean, this is sort of like a lot of what we see in medicine, right? The cost of dealing with diabetes is a lot more than the cost of actually trying to prevent diabetes by educating people not to drink 4 liters of soda every day. So, $35 billion seems like a very expensive way to deal with a problem that my suspicion is might cost less to offset at least some of that. I mean, what are your thoughts in terms of if you would spend that money up front, how would you do that to reduce the introduction of it?
Yeah, but you need to bear in mind it's not just antibiotics. It's heavy metals. It's microplastic. Yeah, I mean, these treatments are going to remove pretty much every chemical that's going down in the wastewater treatment process. So I mean, I think in terms of the UK, antibiotic concentrations in the rivers, the stuff that we see, are generally not that high. The use is getting better. It's fairly well controlled. The chief medical officer in the UK, she's really leading on antibiotics and AMR. So, so I think the usage could probably come down, but I don't think that would happen very quickly.
I'd like to add one more thing. I've got an excellent Swiss study at home. They can show that Lake Geneva, one of the watersheds, the farmers got in a cooperative project, and Lake Geneva's biodiversity and fish and everything, it's a win-win. Guess what they did? They quit using glyphosate. They don't use it to dry crops, and they don't use it, period. And glyphosate, remember, wasn't on his list. They didn't even check for those antibiotics on those slides you showed. And it doesn't break down very easily. There's not a lot of... So Don Huber did the half-life studies for it when he was at Purdue, and when they got it approved as a herbicide, and industry still quotes his studies. And I won't go into all of it, but he spent a good share of his life showing how the study was flawed. So the half-life of this stuff, when we're using it as a drying agent, that's what I'm really death on. When Germany quit doing it 9 years ago, and they're going to phase it out by 2023, even though Bayer's the company that bought Monsanto. The Netherlands banned all spray drying of crops. See, where we get most of it, it's water soluble, and we get most of it from sprayed, dried, non-Roundup crops. And it isn't just small grains, it's lentils and peas. And it's in we dry down our peanuts just to get rid of the vines, I think 35% of them. So it's in there, so see, it can cause some dysbiosis, and then if you get a little leaky bowel, stuff gets into your system. So it's like a kid that gets stung with a bee. Sooner or later, you get allergic to it. So sorry to be just, I know there's way more bad chemicals than that one, but since we're using so much of it, and it fits into soil health and water quality and everything, that's why I'm so one-tracked on it.
Well, we have 5 minutes left, so I Remember, you can also, since you are here, you can continue talking to these folks in person.
Hi, my name is Tajaswi. I am a senior and a bio major, and I want to channel off of Shannon. We took sewage last year together, and what I've realized is that a lot of these papers talking about sewage like to look at Bangladesh and other nations labeled as third world countries for antibiotic resistance. And in that slide that Alistair, I believe, had, you said that Bangladesh has 300 times more antibiotic resistance bacteria, which to me, after taking that class, is like, no duh. Like, these nations have garbage flowing everywhere. There's no proper wastewater treatment plants. So to me, I'm from Nepal, by the way, and in Kathmandu, in the state that I'm from, there's 5 wastewater treatment plants, but only 1 is actually quote-unquote functioning. So only almost 5% of the raw sewage gets treated, whereas 95% of untreated sewage just gets flown into the rivers. So instead of using these quote-unquote third world nation countries as examples to be like, hey, guess what? Like, this is really bad. What can we do to help these nations instead of just having them to just cite it and be like, it's bad?
Can I take that? I looked at the sewer plants in Kathmandu and around. They have a tremendous problem with tuberculosis, which will go through a treatment plant and be dispersed into the crop fields. And so that's a loop that has to be looked at. Actually, none of their plants work. If you want to really be serious about it.
I agree.
Unfortunately, they don't have the funding or the technology or the capacity and staff to even run those plants. They can play plumber and pipe the water from here to here. They don't understand what's happening or why. And this is not characteristic of Kathmandu. This is characteristic of a lot of the developing countries. They don't have the lab capacity and the technical knowledge to track this stuff. Kampala, the sewer plant there, was putting out stuff a quarter of a mile away from the city's intake from fresh water. And it doesn't make sense, but it's very difficult to get them to understand what the long-term issue are. And this is where the UN, if it worked, should be doing something. UNEP, UNDP should be overseeing this and offering. USAID, the Germans, the Swedes, all of these all have international agencies that could very easily do some work in this area. But do they? I have no idea. I'm 40 years out of that now. But it's a serious issue, and it's only going to get worse as the place dries down, as this country dries down, as the rest of the world dries down. Recycled water is going to be more and more and more critical, and unless it's done right, it's just this big source of contamination. And I'm sorry to say that tertiary doesn't work. We've got good data that show that the antibiotic-resistant genes go right through it. And the question is, are antibiotic-resistant genes an issue? I don't know. I don't think anybody knows. But if they're out there, they're creating reservoirs that have to be considered. So if you lose your antibiotics, what's your backup?
All right. So one last, we only have time for one last question. Since you are here, you have the opportunity to talk to our speakers afterwards. I'm going to get one last digital question. This one's a fun one. There's always a fun one. Is it possible for an inanimate object to have a microbiome? For example, if an object has a set of microbes and bacteria attached to it, would that constitute that object having a microbiome? Henry says, let me know if this doesn't make sense. I was just interested in this as a lot of the documents we are discussing see humans and plants and other live things as having microbiomes rather than inanimate objects. And I was just wondering if an object gets some microbes or bacteria from a living object in some pathogenic spaces we were talking about, would it constitute objects as having microbiomes. And I guess my follow-up to Henry's question is, if objects do have microbiomes,
Yeah, they do.
then how are we considering those kinds of things in our grand system and plans to actually deal with this issue?
They're called biofilms.
Yeah, so that's what I was going to say too. We generally just use different terminology for that. Biofilms are strong colonies of microorganisms that secrete a matrix that makes them resistant to falling off or being washed away. And we need to, to remove them, you need like scrubbing or ultrasonic cleaners or other means to reduce them. And usually applications of things like disinfectants and antiseptics won't take care of them. And they're a big deal in human medicine and veterinary medicine and hospitals. But we think of the microbiome as being the colonization of the living organism, and we think of the bacteria that colonize inanimate objects. We just call that collectively a biofilm.
Or a biomatrix or a prion would all fit there. Any of those, they don't have DNA or RNA, but they self-replicate. Form a protein sheath and or have the polysaccharide involvement with the biofilm. But a number of those very definitely have that microbiome.
And Professor Deirdre?
Water pipes are famous for that.
I was just going to add, you have some interesting bacteria like some Pseudomonas that actually exist on plants and can damage plants, but they also can aerate and go up into the upper atmosphere, and then they can cause freezing at sub 30, at temperatures where you shouldn't get snow formation. They can cause that and then float back down to plants somewhere else in the world and infect again, and they cycle back and forth and back and forth. So it's media and living things that both enjoy the microbes.
All right. And on that note, thank you to our panelists and thank you to our students for your questions. I'll give it over to Roger now.
So I want to thank you all. We're going to do this again tomorrow at 1 for like 3 hours or 2 hours. And we're going to really try and get some interdisciplinary conversations going, which I think we're beginning, and I'm very excited about it. We reconvene tomorrow at 9:30. We'll have Rodney Dietert again and Larry Weiss talking about the original microbiome, so studying anthropology in the Yanomami in the Amazon and what we can learn about the microbiome through that. David Lewis and Tyrone Hayes, who's coming in tonight, are going to be talking about this question of fear, again, the price of telling truth in science. And that's going to be, I think, really exceptional. Then we'll have a lunch, and then this convergences. Also, Dana Stanley from Australia, who couldn't make it, is going to Skype in for about 20 minutes and talk to us at 1 o'clock tomorrow, right before the Convergences program. So we have a great day tomorrow. Please come back. Thank you all for being here. I do want to say one thing about what all these people can do. That was a question, and you're powerful people. I've been running conferences like this. I mean, this is a new topic for me, but conferences for 13 years here at BART. This is the only conference I've ever run where everyone I asked said yes. Wow. Everyone I asked said yes. People here, all of you have clearly made a decision to try and make this issue important. And that was really meaningful. It was deeply noticeable. I couldn't believe it. It's usually pulling teeth to get people to come to a conference. And people were excited, really excited. And that's to your credit. And I think it's something we all should be aware of. So thank you all. And